Our top story, the United States is trying to isolate Russia. The United Kingdom is imposing more sanctions. France has vowed to take tougher measures against Moscow. And the International Criminal Court has issued an arrest warrant against Vladimir Putin. But what's happening currently in Moscow? This. Chinese President Xi Jinping is on a 3-day visit. Today is day 2 of his engagements. The two presidents shook hands and stood side by side, a visual that's going to be more symbolic than just a photo opportunities. It goes without saying that the West is closely monitoring what happens within those high Kremlin walls. There is constant talk about an alliance in the making, but it is not so black and white. The West is bent on branding the discourse as one about authoritarianism versus democracy. Even before the war, China and Russia signed a no-limit partnership, and the invasion of Ukraine has brought them even closer. But do they really intend to forge an alliance? Russia and China have strong military and economic ties, but they are far from forming a military alliance and even further away from being under any obligation to support each other's wars. A formal alliance comes with commitments, and neither of the two nations are looking for something like that, it would seem. It could possibly threaten individual interests. Moscow has intervened thrice in other countries in the last 20 years, in Georgia, Syria and Ukraine. And China has very little interest in these countries. Russia cannot support China blindly. Beijing has issues with New Delhi and Hanoi, but for Moscow, these are key partners. So why are Xi Jinping and Vladimir Putin meeting? For Russia, it's a message to everyone who has opposed its war in Ukraine, saying it is not so isolated after all. And to maintain this narrative, support from countries of the global south is critical. For China, this is more of a re-emergence moment. Xi can protect, or rather project, his country as a defiant global superpower, a reliable partner and a potential peacemaker. When he said Beijing is ready to stand guard over the world order, the Chinese president made this more than clear. The United States is certainly a catalyst here. Washington's much propagated narrative that says Ukraine today, Taiwan tomorrow has done two things. One, increased global animosity. Two, given birth to an unexpected partnership. And the West has begun to recognize the strength of this partnership. But observers say it lacks a long-term vision and strategy to deal with it. For more on this, we're now joined by Colonel Rich Outzen from Washington, D.C. He's a senior fellow at the Atlantic Council and Jamestown Foundation. Thanks so much for joining us on WION. As I said at the start of the show, the world is watching with rapt attention as these two leaders hold talks in Moscow. What do you believe is likely to emerge from this high-profile meeting? Could we see a geopolitical shift and fresh realignments? And how concerned is the United States about a possible new alliance between Moscow and Beijing, especially if it's military in nature?
Well, thanks. And those are questions that are on the top of everyone's minds here in Washington, I'm sure, as well in India. The truth is that the convergence, if you will, between these two regimes or these two governments predates the war in Ukraine a good deal. And this no-limits partnership that you referred to is of great consequence, certainly for the world, depending on how it plays out. If it's mostly rhetorical or economic in nature, and we can say that the economic ties between the two have grown closer since the Ukraine war, largely as a result of the sanctions placed on Russia by the West, there is some meat there. And yet we have to look at the term critically too. No limits partnership implies a sort of a relationship of equals. And one thing this war has done is demonstrated that Russia is no equal to China. Russia has suffered military defeats. It has lost an incredible amount of military equipment. Its costs are in the hundreds of billions of dollars for this failed war so far. And they've become much more dependent on China. So one thing that's happening, I think, in this trip is that Xi is going to Moscow to say, how bad is this? And how bad of a horse have we backed in this particular race? Xi and the Chinese have no interest in seeing Putin fail altogether, and they've made noises about negotiations. They'd probably like to see this war end before it gets much worse, before Putin digs that much more of a hole. So we're concerned about any U.S. Or the U.S. is concerned about any Chinese military support that would go to Russia. But there might be some benefits from having Xi talk sense to Putin, who's clearly underestimated his opponent and misjudged the situation he's in.
All right. Well, certainly it is a very, very important meeting that is being very closely watched around the globe. Now, China claims it wants to play peacemaker, but can it play an honest broker, given that it has largely sided with Russia in this war? Can China be trusted? Is Ukraine willing to trust China on this? And do you see Beijing being able to influence the course of the Ukraine war?
Well, most of the leverage that China has is over Russia, of course, because of the fact that it is a major trade partner. It's buying oil and other raw materials from Russia. So certainly that economic relationship gives it some leverage over what the Russians do and maybe motivating them to more peace. Or on the other hand, if they supply more weapons, they have supplied reportedly some weapons, but if they ramp that up, they can prolong the war. But over Ukraine, while China's tried to keep a sort of commodious relationship, they have no real influence because at this stage, Ukraine thinks that defending its national territory is still worth fighting over. And frankly, they think that they can, in the end, recover that national territory. And China's not going to be able to convince Ukraine that that's not the case. So I think they're weakly positioned to be the broker per se, but they're well positioned to be an influencer on Russia to make Russia think more reasonably or realistically about negotiations to end the war.
All right. So can China really play an important role in perhaps bringing this war to some sort of a conclusion? That, of course, remains to be seen. But on that note, Colonel Richardson, thanks so much for sharing your perspective with WION.